All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic, earth-shattering events in all of history, the French Revolution. This was a moment that didn't just rattle France to its core, it sent shockwaves across the entire globe, completely rewriting our ideas about liberty, equality, and what it means to be a citizen. I mean, think about that question for a second. How does an entire nation get to the point where it puts its own king on trial and executes him? It's pretty shocking, right? Well, that question is at the very heart of this story. We're going to look at how France went from an absolute monarchy, where the king's word was literally law, to a republic so revolutionary it was willing to do the unthinkable. This is a story about a society turning itself completely upside down. To really get why it all exploded, you have to understand the setup first. Think of it this way. 18th century France wasn't just a country, it was a giant powder keg, just stuffed with inequality and years of resentment, basically waiting for a single spark. And the social division was, well, insane. Just look at this. A whopping 98% of the entire population belonged to what was called the Third Estate. 98%! Yet that tiny little 2%, the clergy and the nobility, held pretty much all the wealth and all the power. It was a system that was just begging to break. This table really lays out the raw deal everyone was getting. You had the First and Second Estates living a life of total privilege. They owned the land, got all the best jobs, and, get this, paid almost no taxes. Meanwhile, the Third Estate, and that's everyone from lawyers and merchants to the poorest farmers, had to carry the entire country on their backs. They paid all the heavy taxes, but had absolutely zero say in how the country was run. So you might be wondering, how on earth was a system this unfair justified? Well, it all came down to an idea called the divine right of kings. The story everyone was told was that the king wasn't just a ruler, he was chosen by God. And that meant the people's only job was to shut up and obey. This belief gave the monarchy absolute, unquestionable power. But that feeling of powerlessness, it wasn't gonna last. A whole bunch of new ideas and some really terrible crises started to light the fuse on that national powder keg. At the same time, something called the Enlightenment was happening, and these new ideas were spreading like wildfire. You had philosophers like John Locke saying, hey, a government should be chosen by the people. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was talking all about freedom and equality. And Montesquieu argued that power shouldn't just be in one person's hands. Suddenly, people had the intellectual ammunition they needed to question everything. And while these ideas were swirling, France had a very real problem on the ground. The population had absolutely exploded, jumping from 2 crore to almost 2.8 crore by 1789. That's a lot more mouths to feed, and the country just couldn't keep up. On top of that, the government was completely broke. Why? Decades of super expensive wars, including helping out the American Revolution, had plunged the country into massive debt. In fact, it was so bad that a staggering 50% of the entire national budget was being spent just paying the interest on its loans. And then came the final straw. A few terrible harvests in a row meant the price of bread, the one thing the poor depended on to survive, went through the roof. People were literally starving in the streets. They were overtaxed, they had these new ideas about freedom, and now they couldn't even afford to eat. The anger was about to boil over. And in 1789, it finally did. That toxic mix of social injustice, revolutionary ideas, and total economic desperation created an unstoppable force. The explosion was here. And once it started, things happened fast. I mean, really fast. On May 5th, the king calls a meeting to try and raise taxes, yet again. The Third Estate says, no way. By June 20th, they've broken off, declared themselves the National Assembly, and sworn an oath to write a new constitution. Then, on July 14th, the people of Paris storm the Bastille prison, a hated symbol of the king's power. The revolution was on. Make no mistake, creating the National Assembly was a huge deal. This was the turning point. It was a radical act of defiance. The people weren't asking for a seat at the table anymore. They were building their own table, declaring that they were the ones who truly represented the nation, not the king. And one of the very first things this new assembly did was issue the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This was a game changer. It boldly stated that all men were born free and equal in their rights. All those Enlightenment ideas about liberty and equality, they were now the official foundation of a new France. But, and this is a big but, the initial hope and optimism of the revolution would soon curdle into something much, much darker and more violent. The struggle for control was about to get ugly. This period became known as the Reign of Terror. With fears of foreign invasion and enemies within, the most radical revolutionaries took control, and an atmosphere of pure paranoia swept the nation. Just being suspected of not being loyal enough to the revolution could get you arrested and killed, often without a real trial. And the symbol of this brutal period was the guillotine. The crazy thing is, it was originally pitched as a more humane way to execute people. But that sharp, angled blade quickly became an instrument of mass terror, silencing thousands. And the scale of the killing was just breathtaking. In about 1 year, the official count of people executed by the guillotine was 16,000. 16,000! The revolution had truly started to eat its own. And nobody was safe from it, not even the king. On January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was executed in public. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed him to the guillotine that October. This was it. This was the ultimate point of no return. The old France was dead and gone. So, after all the bloodshed, all the chaos, what was left? What did it all mean? Well, the legacy of the French Revolution is absolutely profound, but it's also deeply, deeply complicated. I mean, the changes were massive. You can see it clearly side by side. The absolute monarchy was gone, replaced forever by the idea of a republic. Power shifted from the old-school nobles to the rising middle class, and the church was knocked from its pedestal, its political power totally stripped away. The old world was shattered. But here is the single greatest irony of the entire revolution. All those years of chaos and war created a power vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a brilliant, ambitious military general named Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, he seized power, and a few years later, he crowned himself emperor. Think about that. France got rid of one absolute ruler, fought a revolution for freedom, only to end up with another one. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? A fight for freedom that ends with a dictator. A struggle for equality that leads to a bloodbath. The revolution, without a doubt, paved the way for modern democracy, but the cost was immense. Was it worth it? That's a question historians and all of us are still debating to this day.